Imagine the world in 1492. Europe is divided into warring kingdoms. The Renaissance is awakening art and science, but the world beyond Europe remains largely unknown, mysterious, dangerous, filled with legend. Tales of distant lands circulate through the courts and taverns of Europe. Marco Polo's accounts of Asia, stories of gold, spices, silk, kingdoms of unimaginable wealth. But there's a problem. The Ottoman Empire controls the land routes to Asia. Trade is difficult, expensive, dangerous. European monarchs dream of finding a new route. A sea route, direct access to the riches of the East. One man believed he could do it. His name was Christopher Columbus. What he would discover would change the world forever, though not in the way he imagined. This is not just the story of one man's voyage. This is the story of two worlds colliding, of civilizations that had existed for thousands of years, suddenly facing an invasion they never saw coming. This is the story of how America was discovered and what that discovery cost. This is the untold story of 1492. Section 1. The world before Columbus. Before we talk about European discovery, we need to understand a crucial truth. America was never discovered in 1492. It was already home. For over 15,000 years, perhaps, as long as 20,000 humans had inhabited the Americas, they had migrated from Asia across a land bridge that once connected Siberia to Alaska during the last ice age. Over millennia, they spread throughout North and South America. From the Arctic Circle to the tip of Patagonia, they adapted to every environment, imaginable: frozen, tundra, dense rainforests, scorching deserts, fertile river valleys, and they built civilizations. Let's journey through the Americas as they existed before 1492. The Aztec Empire in the Valley of Mexico stood Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire. With a population of over 200,000, it was one of the largest cities in the world, larger than any European city at the time. Imagine a city built on an island in the middle of a lake, connected to the mainland by massive causeways. Towering pyramids dominated the skyline. Intricate canal systems provided transportation. Floating gardens called chinampas produced food. Markets bustled with traders selling goods from across the empire: cocoa, jade, colorful feathers, obsidian weapons. The Aztecs were skilled engineers, astronomers, and artists. They had a complex calendar system. They performed intricate surgeries. They created beautiful poetry and philosophy, but they were also warriors. They believed the sun god Huitzilopochtli required human blood to rise each day. They conducted ritual sacrifices, thousands each year, of prisoners captured in war. The Aztec Empire ruled over millions of people across central Mexico, collecting tribute from conquered peoples. It was powerful, sophisticated, and utterly unlike anything Europeans had ever encountered. The Inca Empire, stretching along the western coast of South America. The Inca Empire was the largest empire in the pre-Columbian Americas. It extended from modern-day Colombia to Chile, over 2,500 miles. The capital, Cusco, sat high in the Andes Mountains. The Incas built incredible stone cities, like the famous Machu Picchu. Without wheels, horses, or iron tools, they constructed roads spanning thousands of miles, bridges suspended over deep gorges, and irrigation systems that turned mountains into productive farmland. They had a sophisticated government bureaucracy. They kept records using quipas, knotted strings, that functioned as a form of writing. They practiced advanced medicine, including brain surgery. The Inca Empire was wealthy beyond imagination, with massive stores of gold and silver. This wealth would later attract Spanish conquistadors like moths to a flame. North American civilizations. North America was equally diverse and complex. The Mississippian culture, centered around the Mississippi River, had built great cities. Cahokia, near modern-day St. Louis, was home to 20,000 people at its peak around 1100 AD. They constructed massive earthwork mounds. The largest, Monk's Mound, was bigger than the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza. By 1492, Cahokia had declined, but Mississippian culture persisted across the southeast. In the southwest, the Pueblo peoples built extraordinary cliff dwellings. Mesa Verde and Chaco Cañandis were not primitive shelters. They were multi-story apartment complexes made of stone and adobe, with hundreds of rooms. The Pueblones were master astronomers. aligning their buildings with solar and lunar cycles. In the Pacific Northwest, nations like the Chinook and Tlingit lived in abundant cedar forests and rich salmon fisheries. They carved elaborate totem poles, built large cedar longhouses, and created sophisticated art. In the Northeast, the Iroquois Confederacy, a union of 5, later 6 nations, had developed a democratic system of government. They held councils where representatives from each nation met to make decisions affecting all. Some historians believe this confederacy influenced the later United States Constitution. The Great Plains were home to nomadic nations, like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Comanche. Before European horses arrived, they hunted buffalo on foot, using clever tactics to stampede herds over cliffs. Population and diversity. How many people lived in the Americas in 1492? We don't know exactly. Modern estimates range from 50 to 100 million people across North and South America. These weren't a single people. There were hundreds of distinct nations, each with its own language, culture, customs, and beliefs. Some were farmers, growing corn, beans, and squash. Some were hunters and gatherers. Some built great cities. Some lived in small villages. Some were peaceful. Some were warlike. But all of them were about to face an invasion that would devastate their world. What they didn't have. It's important to understand what indigenous Americans lacked, not because they were primitive, but because of geography and biology. They had no horses, cattle, pigs, or sheep. The large mammals available for domestication in the Americas were limited. This meant no animal power for farming or transportation. They had no iron or steel. They worked with stone, copper, and bronze. Most crucially, they had no immunity to European diseases. Living in relative isolation from Europe, Africa, and Asia for thousands of years meant indigenous Americans had never been exposed to smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, and other diseases. When Europeans arrived, they brought these diseases with them. The result would be the greatest demographic catastrophe in human history. But in 1492, indigenous Americans knew nothing of the disaster sailing toward them across the Atlantic. Section 2. Christopher Columbus, the man in the myth. Who was Christopher Columbus? Most of what Americans learn about Columbus is myth. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. He discovered America. He proved the earth was round. It was a hero. The truth is far more complicated. Christopher Columbus was born in 1451 in Genoa, Italy. His father was a wool weaver. Young Christopher went to sea as a teenager, sailing on merchant ships throughout the Mediterranean. He was ambitious, deeply religious, and absolutely convinced of his own destiny. Columbus's obsession. By his 20s, Columbus had become obsessed with an idea: sailing west across the Atlantic to reach Asia. Now, contrary to popular myth, educated Europeans in the 1400s knew the earth was round. Greek mathematicians had proven it nearly 2,000 years earlier. Columbus wasn't trying to prove the earth was round. His plan was based on a simple proposition: if the earth is round, you should be able to reach the east by sailing west. There was one problem. Columbus's geography was completely wrong. He believed the Earth was much smaller than it actually is. He thought Asia extended much farther east than it does. He calculated that Japan was only about 2,400 miles west of the Canary Islands. In reality, it's over 12,000 miles. Educated geographers of the time knew Columbus's calculations were wrong. But Columbus refused to listen. He was utterly convinced he was right. The quest for funding Columbus needed money to fund his expedition. He approached King John II of Portugal first. Portugal was the leader in maritime exploration. Portuguese sailors had been pushing down the coast of Africa for decades, searching for a sea route to Asia around the southern tip of Africa. King John's advisors examined Columbus's plan. They concluded his geography was wrong and rejected his proposal. Columbus turned to Spain. Spain was newly unified. In 1492, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella had just conquered Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Spain. The Reconquista, the Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula, was complete after nearly 800 years. Isabella was interested in spreading Christianity. Ferdinand was interested in wealth and glory. Columbus promised both. He offered them gold, spices, and new converts to Christianity. He asked in return for titles Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy of any lands he discovered, and 10% of all wealth from those lands. After years of negotiation, Isabella finally agreed. Why did Spain say yes? Why would Spain fund what most experts considered a foolish venture? First, the potential rewards were enormous. If Columbus succeeded, Spain would gain a direct route to Asia, bypassing Muslim and Italian middlemen who controlled the spice trade. Second, Portugal dominated the African route to Asia. Spain needed an alternative. Third, the cost was relatively modest, 3 small ships and about 90 men. If Columbus failed, Spain wouldn't lose much. Fourth, Isabella was genuinely motivated by religious zeal. She had just expelled all Jews from Spain in 1490, to a decision that would haunt Spain's economy for centuries. She saw spreading Christianity as her divine mission. Finally, Columbus was extraordinarily persuasive. He radiated confidence. He believed with absolute certainty that God had chosen him for this mission. Isabella took the gamble. Columbus assembled 3 ships for his voyage. T. Santa Maria, Columbus's flagship. About 70 feet long, it could carry about 40 men. The Pinta, slightly smaller and faster, about 20 men. The Niña, the smallest, about 50 feet long, about 24 men. These weren't large ships. They were smaller than many modern fishing boats, yet Columbus was preparing to cross 3,000 miles of unknown ocean in them. His crew of about 90 men were mostly Spanish sailors, with a few Italians and other nationalities. Many were ex-convicts who'd been promised pardons if they survived the voyage. They had no idea where they were really going or what they would find. The voyage begins August 3, 1492. The 3 ships departed from Palos, Spain. They sailed to the Canary Islands first, where they resupplied and made repairs. On September 6th, they left the Canary Islands and headed west into the unknown. Columbus's plan was to sail west at approximately 28 degrees north latitude, the latitude of the Canary Islands, until he reached Japan, which he believed was about 2,400 miles away. The first few weeks were smooth. The wind was favorable. The weather was good. The ships made steady progress. But as days turned into weeks, with no land in sight, the crew grew nervous. They were sailing into waters no European had ever crossed. They had no maps, no knowledge of what lay ahead. Superstitious fears haunted them. Would they sail off the edge of the world? Would see monsters devour them? By early October, they had sailed over 3,000 miles, far longer than Columbus had predicted. The crew was near mutiny. Columbus promised them 3 more days. If they didn't find land, they would turn back. On October 11th, sailors began seeing signs floating, branches with green leaves, carved wooden sticks, landbirds. Land was near. October 12, 1492. At 2 a.m. on October 12, 1492, the lookout on the Pinta, Rodrigo de Triana, saw something in the moonlight. Land! At dawn, Columbus and his men went ashore on a small island in the Bahamas. Columbus named it San Salvador, Holy Savior. They had crossed the Atlantic. They had discovered from a European perspective a new world. But Columbus didn't realize it. He believed he had reached islands off the coast of Asia. He called the inhabitants Indians because he thought he was in the Indies. He would go to his grave believing he had reached Asia. He never understood he had discovered 2 vast continents completely unknown to Europeans. First contact on the beach of San Salvador, 2 worlds met for the first time. Columbus described the indigenous people, the Taíno, in his journal. They should be good servants and intelligent. I observed that they quickly took in what was said to them, and I believe that they would easily be made Christians, as it appeared to me that they had no religion. This description reveals Columbus's mindset. He immediately saw these people as potential servants and converts, not as equals, not as people with their own cultures, beliefs, and rights. The Taíno, for their part, were curious and friendly. They offered gift spirits, cotton thread, spears. Columbus gave them glass beads and small bells. But Columbus noted something that would seal the Taíno's fate. They ought to make good and skilled servants, for they repeat very quickly whatever we say to them. And critically, I saw that they were a people who could better be freed and converted to our holy faith by love than by force. so I gave them some red caps and glass beads, which pleased them much. They became so entirely our friends that it was a wonder to see. But Columbus's real interest was gold. The Taíno wore small gold ornaments. Columbus immediately demanded to know where the gold came from. The Taíno pointed south and west. More gold, more islands. Columbus decided to explore further. Taking several Taíno as guides, though kidnapped, would be more accurate. Section 3. Columbus's Voyages and the Taíno Genocide. Columbus spent the next 3 months exploring the Caribbean. He visited Cuba, which he believed was mainland China. He reached Hispaniola, modern-day Haiti, and Dominican Republic, where he found more gold. On Hispaniola, the Santa Maria ran aground and was wrecked. Columbus left 39 men behind to establish a settlement, La Navidad, first European settlement in the Americas. On January 16, 1493, Columbus began his return voyage to Spain, taking several kidnapped Taíno with him. The return journey was harrowing. The ships encountered terrible storms. The crews feared they would sink. Columbus wrote a letter describing his discoveries, sealed it in a barrel, and threw it overboard, hoping it would reach Spain even if he died. But they survived. March 5-10, 1493. Columbus returned to Spain. He was greeted as a hero. Columbus's presentation. Columbus presented himself to Ferdinand and Isabella in Barcelona. He brought the Taíno captives, parrots, gold jewelry, exotic plants, and tales of islands rich with gold. The Spanish monarchs were thrilled. The Pope issued papal bulls dividing the New World between Spain and Portugal. Spain claimed everything Columbus had discovered. Columbus was showered with honors. He was made Admiral of the Ocean Sea and Viceroy of the Indies. His family was in. Plans immediately began for a second, much larger expedition. The second voyage, Conquest, September 25, 1493. Columbus departed on his second voyage with a fleet of 17 ships and about 1,200 men. This was no longer an expedition of discovery. This was colonization. The fleet included soldiers, farmers, priests, and laborers. They brought horses, cattle, pigs, and seeds to establish settlements. They brought weapons to enforce Spanish control. Columbus had promised Ferdinand and Isabella gold and converts. He intended to deliver. November 1493. The fleet reached the Caribbean. Columbus discovered that La Navidad had been destroyed. All 39 men were dead. What had happened? The Spanish had abused the Taíno, taking their food, their gold, and their women. The Taíno had finally fought back, wiping out the settlement. Columbus established a new settlement, La Isabela en Hispaniola. But the colony struggled. Supplies ran short, disease spread, the Spanish fought among themselves, and most disappointingly, there wasn't as much gold as Columbus had promised. The encomienda system Columbus needed to produce wealth to satisfy his sponsors. He implemented a brutal system. Every Taíno above age 14 was required to bring a certain quota of gold every 3 months. Those who complied received a copper token to wear around their necks. Those who didn't were punished sometimes by having their hands cut off. The problem was, there simply wasn't that much gold on Hispaniola. Many Taíno fled to the mountains. Others tried to resist. Columbus responded with extreme violence. Spanish soldiers, armored and mounted on horses, the Taíno had never seen, hunted down resistors. Columbus also began enslaving the Taíno, shipping them to Spain to be sold. In Isidro, he sent by Taíno slaves to Spain. About 200 died during the voyage. The catastrophe unfolds. But the real killer wasn't violence, it was disease. The Spanish brought smallpox, measles, typhus, and influenza. The Taíno had no immunity. These diseases spread like wildfire. Imagine a disease where 30% of those infected die. Now imagine it spreading through a population that has never encountered it before. Entire villages were wiped out. Families died together. The Taíno population of Hispaniola in 1492 is estimated at 250,000 to 1 million. By 1548, just 56 years later, only Wubatano remained. This wasn't just conquest. It was genocide. Whether intentional or not, the result was the near-complete extinction of the Taíno people. And it was just the beginning. This pattern would repeat across the Americas over the next century. Columbus's later voyage. Columbus made 2 more voyages to the New World. Third voyage, 1498. He explored South America, reaching the Orinoco River in Venezuela. He still believed this was Asia. Fourth voyage, 1502. He explored Central America, desperately searching for a passage to the Indian Ocean. He never found it. By this time, Columbus's reputation had soured. Reports of his brutal governance reached Spain. Colonists complained. In 1500, he was arrested and sent back to Spain in chains. Though he was eventually released and pardoned, Columbus never regained his former glory. He died in 1506, still believing he had reached Asia, never realizing he had discovered a new world. Columbus's legacy. A complicated story. So, was Columbus a hero or a villain? From a European perspective, he was incredibly brave. Crossing the Atlantic in 1492 took extraordinary courage. His voyages connected to hemispheres that had been separated for thousands of years. He changed world history, but from an indigenous perspective, Columbus brought catastrophe. His arrival triggered invasion, disease, enslavement, and genocide. Millions of indigenous people died as a direct result of European colonization that Columbus initiated. Columbus himself was a product of his time, a 15th century European who thought nothing of enslaving people, who was motivated by gold and glory. He was neither a pure hero nor a pure villain. He was a complex, flawed human being whose actions had consequences far beyond what he could have imagined. Today, Columbus remains controversial. Others condemn him as a conqueror and enslaver. Perhaps the truth is that we can acknowledge his courage and navigational skill, while also recognizing the horrific consequences of his voyages. History is complicated. People are complicated. Columbus was no exception. Section 4. The European invasion expands. Columbus's voyages opened the floodgates. News of the New World spread rapidly through Europe. Other explorers, conquistadors, and colonizers quickly followed. The Treaty of Tordesillas 1494, Spain and Portugal nearly went to war over the New World. Pope Alexander VI intervened, drawing a line on a map dividing the world between them. Spain got everything west of the line, most of the Americas. Portugal got everything east, including Brazil, Africa, and Asia. Other European nations, France, England, the Netherlands, ignored this agreement. They had their own colonial ambitions. The age of exploration begins. John Cabot, sailing for England, reached Newfoundland. England claimed North America. 1499 to 1502. Amerigo Vespucci explored the South American coast. He realized this was a new continent, not Asia. A German cartographer named the continent America in his honor. Vasco de Balboa crossed Panama and became the first European to see the Pacific Ocean from the Americas. 1519 to 1522. Ferdinand Magellan's expedition circumnavigated the globe, proving the Earth's true size. The voyage also revealed just how vast the Pacific Ocean was and how wrong Columbus's calculations had been. But the most dramatic and brutal conquests were yet to come. Hernán Cortés and the conquest of the Aztec Empire, 1519 to 1521. In 1519, Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés landed in Mexico with about 600 men, 16 horses, and a few cannons. He was going to conquer the Aztec Empire. On paper, this was insane. The Aztec Empire had millions of subjects and tens of thousands of warriors. Cortés had 11 men. He was outnumbered thousands to 1. But Cortés had advantages the Aztecs lacked. Technology, Spanish, steel swords, and armor were vastly superior to Aztec obsidian weapons, horses which the Aztecs had never seen to terrify them. Cannons and guns, though primitive, were psychologically devastating. Disease. Smallpox arrived with the Spanish. It ravaged the Aztec population. The Aztec Emperor Cuitlahua died of smallpox. Countless warriors and civilians perished. Alliances. The Aztec Empire ruled through fear and tribute. Many conquered peoples hated the Aztecs. Cortés allied with these groups, particularly the Tlaxcalan Sioux, provided thousands of warriors. Their Emperor Montezuma II believed Cortés might be the god Quetzalcoatl returning, as prophecy foretold. This hesitation gave Cortés time to establish himself. November 1519, Cortés entered Tenochtitlan. Montezuma welcomed him, courts took Montezuma hostage, ruling through him. But tensions escalated. June 1520. The Spanish attacked during an Aztec religious festival, massacring hundreds of unarmed civilians. The Aztecs rose in fury. Montezuma was killed either by the Spanish or by angry Aztecs. Courts fled Tenochtitlan in the Noche Triste, Night of Sorrows, losing hundreds of men. Bat Cortés, regrouped. For 93 days, the Aztecs held out, but they were devastated by smallpox, cut off from food and water, and facing overwhelming numbers. August 13, 1521. Tenochtitlan fell. The Aztec Empire was destroyed. Spanish sources claim 100,000 Aztec civilians died during the siege. The city was razed. On its ruins, the Spanish built Mexico City, Francisco Pizarro, and the conquest of the Inca Empire 1532 to 1533. The conquest of the Incas followed a similar pattern. Francisco Pizarro landed in Peru with just 168 men and 62 horses. The Inca Empire was massive, 12 million people across 2,500 miles. But it was weakened by civil war. The Emperor Huayna Capac had died of smallpox, which had spread from Central America before the Spanish even arrived in Peru. His sons Atahualpa and Huáscar fought for the throne. Atahualpa had just won when Pizarro arrived. November 16, 1532. Pizarro met Atahualpa at Cajamarca. Pizarro invited the emperor to a meeting. Atahualpa arrived with several thousand unarmed attendants, Ituasa trapped. Pizarro's men opened fire with cannons and guns. They charged on horseback. In the chaos, they captured Atahualpa and slaughtered thousands of Incas. Atahualpa offered a ransom, a room filled with gold and 2 rooms filled with silver. Pizarro accepted. The Incas delivered the largest ransom in history. Then Pizarro executed Atahualpa anyway. With the emperor dead and the capital Cusco captured, the Inca Empire collapsed. The Spanish seized control of Peru, claiming its vast wealth of gold and silver. Why did these conquests succeed? How did a few hundred Spaniards conquer empires of millions? Jared Diamond, in his book Guns, Germs, and Steel, argues 3 factors were decisive. Germs, European diseases, smallpox killed far more indigenous people than Spanish weapons ever did. Estimates suggest 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died from disease within a century of European contact. Steel, European metallurgy was far advanced. Steel swords, armor, and guns gave the Spanish a massive technological advantage. Horses, the Americas had no large domesticated animals. Horses gave the Spanish mobility and shock power in battle. Add to this Spanish military tactics, alliances with local groups, and sometimes sheer luck, and you get a catastrophic collapse of indigenous American civilizations. The demographic catastrophe. Let's talk numbers. In 1491, the population of the Americas is estimated at 50 to 100 million people. By 1600, just over a century later, the indigenous population had declined to about 5 to 10 million. That's a 90% population loss. Over 50 million people dead. This is one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in human history, comparable to the Black Death in Europe. Except it lasted longer and killed a higher percentage of the population. The primary killer was disease, smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, and others. But violence, forced labor, starvation, and social collapse also played roles. Entire civilizations vanished, languages disappeared, cultures were destroyed. Knowledge was lost forever. The Taíno, the Aztecs, the Incas, and hundreds of smaller nations whose names we no longer know. Francisco Pizarro landed in Peru with just 168 men and 62 horses. The Inca Empire was massive, 12 million people across 2,500 miles. But it was weakened by civil war. The Emperor Huayna Capac had died of smallpox, which had spread from Central America before the Spanish even arrived in Peru. His sons Atahualpa and Huáscar fought for the throne. Atahualpa had just won when Pizarro arrived. November 16, 1532. Pizarro met Atahualpa at Cajamarca. Pizarro invited the emperor to a meeting. Atahualpa arrived with several thousand unarmed attendants, Ituasa trapped. Pizarro's men opened fire with cannons and guns. They charged on horseback. In the chaos, they captured Atahualpa and slaughtered thousands of Incas. Atahualpa offered a ransom, a room filled with gold, and 2 rooms filled with silver. Pizarro accepted. The Incas delivered the largest ransom in history. Then Pizarro executed Atahualpa anyway. With the emperor dead and the capital Cusco captured, the Inca Empire collapsed. The Spanish seized control of Peru, claiming its vast wealth of gold and silver. Why did these conquests succeed? How did a few hundred Spaniards conquer empires of millions? Jared Diamond, in his book Guns, Germs, and Steel, argues 3 factors were decisive. Germs, European diseases, smallpox killed far more indigenous people than Spanish weapons ever did. Estimates suggest 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died from disease within a century of European contact. Steel, European metallurgy was far advanced. Steel swords, armor, and guns gave the Spanish a massive technological advantage. Horses, the Americas had no large domesticated animals. Horses gave the Spanish mobility and shock power in battle. Add to this Spanish military tactics, alliances with local groups, and sometimes sheer luck, and you get a catastrophic collapse of indigenous American civilizations. The demographic catastrophe. Let's talk numbers. In 1491, the population of the Americas is estimated at 50 to 100 million people. By 1600, just over a century later, the indigenous population had declined to about 5 to 10 million. That's a 90% population loss. Over 50 million people dead. This is one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in human history, comparable to the Black Death in Europe. Except it lasted longer and killed a higher percentage of the population. The primary killer was disease: smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, and others. But violence, forced labor, starvation, and social collapse also played roles. Entire civilizations vanished, languages disappeared, cultures were destroyed. Knowledge was lost forever. The Taíno, the Aztecs, the Incas, and hundreds of smaller nations whose names we no longer know. Over the next 350 years, approximately 12 to 15 million Africans would be forcibly transported to the Americas. About 2 million died during the Middle Passage, the brutal ocean voyage. This slave trade would become one of the greatest crimes in human history, with consequences that still reverberate today. Resistance and adaptation. Indigenous people didn't simply accept conquest and colonization. They resisted, some fought militarily, and occasionally won. The Mapuche people of Chile successfully resisted Spanish conquest for over 300 years. Some fled to remote areas, mountains, jungles, deserts where Europeans couldn't easily follow. Some adopted learning Spanish or Portuguese, converting to Christianity, at least outwardly, and finding ways to survive within the colonial system. Some combined resistance and adaptation. In the Caribbean and Latin America, escaped slaves and indigenous people formed independent communities called Maroons, fiercely defending their freedom. Indigenous cultures didn't disappear. They adapted, syncretized, and persisted, often in hidden or altered forms. The mission's Catholic missionaries, particularly Franciscans, Dominicans, and Jesuits, established missions throughout the Americas. Their stated goal was to convert indigenous people to Christianity and civilize them. They built churches, schools, and communities. Some missionaries, like Bartolomé de las Casas, genuinely tried to protect indigenous people from abuse. Las Casas chronicled Spanish atrocities and advocated for indigenous rights, though his suggestion to use African slaves instead had its own horrific consequences. But most missions were part of the colonial project. Indigenous people were forced to abandon their languages, religions, and customs. Children were taken from families. Punishment was harsh. The missions were cultural genocide, even when physical violence was limited. Conclusión 2-7, 3-0. Let's step back and consider what we've covered. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed west, searching for Asia. Instead, he found the Americas, two continents inhabited by millions of people across hundreds of distinct nations. Columbus's discovery wasn't really a discovery at all. It was the beginning of an invasion. What followed was catastrophic for indigenous Americans. 90% of the population died, mostly from European diseases, great civilizations, the Aztecs, the Incas, the Taíno Strait. Survivors were conquered, enslaved, and forced to abandon their cultures. Vast territories were claimed by European empires. This wasn't an inevitable process. It was the result of specific choices. The choice to conquer rather than coexist, to enslave rather than trade as equals, to destroy rather than learn. The European powers that colonized Portugal, France, England, the Netherlands, grew wealthy from the exploitation of indigenous people and enslaved Africans. This wealth helped fund the Industrial Revolution and Europe's global dominance. But the legacy is complicated. The Columbian Exchange transformed the world. Crops from the Americas fed Europe's growing population. European technology and animals changed life in the Americas. For better and worse, the two hemispheres became permanently connected. The colonization of the Americas also laid the groundwork for the modern Western Hemisphere. The United States, Canada, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina all are products of this history. Indigenous peoples didn't vanish, despite European efforts. Today, millions of people in the Americas are indigenous or of mixed indigenous heritage. Indigenous cultures, though transformed and suppressed, survived. In recent decades, there's been a reckoning with this history. Columbus Day has become controversial. Statues have been torn down. Indigenous voices are demanding recognition and justice. How should we remember 1492? Not as a simple story of heroic discovery, but as a complex, painful, transformative moment when two worlds collided with devastating consequences for one side and immense benefits for the other. We can acknowledge the courage of explorers like Columbus while condemning the brutality of conquest. We can recognize the transformative impact of European colonization while mourning what was lost. We can celebrate the resilience of indigenous peoples who survived and adapted. History isn't simple. It's messy, painful, and complicated. The story of America's discovery is a story of bravery and cruelty, innovation and destruction, new beginnings and tragic endings. It's a story we're still grappling with today. This was the discovery of America, not by those who lived there for 15,000 years, but by Europeans who changed the world forever, for better and for worse.